Okay, well, the Theosophical Society was founded in New York in 1875 by Madame Blavatsky, by Colonel Olcott, and by other people such as William Judge. And the Theosophical Society exists to promote and study and live Theosophy, which means divine wisdom. And so that's really, in order to answer the question what the Theosophical Society is, we need to look at what Theosophy is. And there are different ways. Some people say we can get knowledge, to find out answers to the ultimate questions in life. Some people say that all we need to do is study matter and physical things, and through a rigorous study of matter, we can find the meaning of life, whatever that is, if indeed there is one. Other people suggest that there is a divine revelation that is given only to a few, and we have to look to the authority of that revealed tradition. Theosophy means divine wisdom or divine knowledge, and it claims that there is an innate capacity or ability for people, for you, for I, for anyone, if they live the life, to achieve that level of insight and understanding such that it can be called divine. And that is the purpose of the Theosophical Society. The objects, the formal objects of the Theosophical Society are up on the wall behind me to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood without distinction of race, creed, sex, or colour, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. So for me, Theosophy, or membership of the Theosophical Society, means at least some degree of commitment, both to those three objects, and traditionally the first object has been emphasized as being most important, but also some commitment towards pursuing a level of study to enable us to move a little bit further along the path of understanding, with the proviso that study means not just book reading, but the kind of study that's knowledge that's embodied in living. That to me is what membership of the Theosophical Society entails. It's not just knowing what's in a particular book, but it's knowing how to live, or trying to understand how to live. Okay, well, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was a Russian noblewoman who traveled quite widely. She went to America and became an American citizen, and thereby renounced her claims to be a Russian countess, as the American system has it. And she was a great mystic and a great student of esoteric law. And she was the, if you like, the ideological background, provided the ideological background or backbone to the movement. She was a great ideologue of the Theosophical Society, although she never, the most formal position that she held was corresponding secretary. I think by temperament, organisation was not her strong point. Colonel Olcott was a retired Civil War colonel, an American by birth, although his colonelship had been conferred by his work on in administration and rooting out corruption. He never actually fought, or only briefly, in the Civil War itself, which is where the colonelship comes from. He was a very prominent citizen. He sat on the panel that was appointed to investigate the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So he was no mean individual. He had a very responsible position, and the two met because in his youth he'd had an interest in spiritualism, and then as his formal career, which was in law, progressed, then obviously as often happens, the demands of everyday life, get very pressing. And by his own account, he was in New York one day and he thought to himself, oh, it's been a while since I looked into spiritualism. And there was a newspaper called The Banner of Light. It should be pointing out that spiritualism had gone through two phases at least. It's still around as a movement and is still very popular. But it began around about 1848 in America with Fox sisters and the Rappins at their home. And then after the family sisters had been kind of discredited, it kind of went out of favor. But the American Civil War led to a big increase or re-interest in spiritualism because, of course, unfortunately, when you have wars, you have casualties, and when you have casualties, you have widows, and it led to an increase of interest in what happens when people die. And so there'd been an upsurge of interest in spiritualism following the American Civil War. And Olcott read about some events that were going on at the Eddy farmstead in Chittenden, Vermont. And he went along there, and Madame Blavatsky was there. And by his own account, in his book called Diary Leaves, which is an edited version of the diaries he kept, it's in 6 volumes, when he first saw her, he said to the friend who we entered with, said to her, good heavens, look at that specimen on you. And Madame Blavatsky was rather large, had a mop of unruly blonde hair, enjoyed rolling her own tobacco and smoking, and she was wearing a bright red blouse or shirt, which indicated support for the Italian revolutionist Garibaldi. And a little bit later, they met outside the farmhouse and began chatting. And she expressed the hope that she hoped that Colonel Olcott, who'd been writing about spiritualism in the press, wasn't there to report on her. And he introduced himself, and that became the beginning of a firm friendship, which pretty much carried on with arguments along the way until her death in 1891. Between them, they set up a house with Olcott's sister in a flat in New York, and they began by holding, if you like, a kind of salons, conversaciones, in which a variety of subjects were discussed. And it was at that place where somebody at one point suggested that they form a formal society to study the kinds of subjects that they were talking about, and that's the actual birth of the Theosophical Society. After Colonel Olcott and Madame Blavatsky moved to India, they made contact with a chap called A.P. Sinnett, who was the editor of a newspaper called The Pioneer. And there were various kind of miraculous phenomena associated with Madame Blavatsky. Things were happening, and she referred to the brothers, if you will. And Sinnett asked if it would be possible for Blavatsky to put him in touch with the masters or Mahatmas. Mahatma simply means great soul. And she said she wasn't certain, but it might be possible. And so he wrote a letter which he dematerialized or otherwise got to the Mahatmas. And he was so impatient, or so eager for this correspondence to start, that he wrote a second one before he received a reply to the first letter. But he began to receive letters from the Mahatmas, which are in the British Library now, and they came in a variety of ways. Sometimes occultly they would appear as if from thin air. Other times he would receive a letter in the post from one person, and the Mahatma would have written something in the margin, and sometimes they came in relatively normal ways. And this is the correspondence that is the Mahatma letters. Although Cynic wasn't the only person to receive Mahatma letters, there were a number of people, but his are, if you like, the most substantial and sequential body of teaching. Although unfortunately, for some reason, because probably a lack of forethought, sometimes he didn't keep the questions, didn't keep a copy of the questions that he asked, and he didn't keep a record of the chronology of the letters. And so sometimes I'm looking at, because I've been published since the 1920s, sometimes in reading the letters, we have to try and use our minds or intuition to try and figure out what the exact answer is that the Mahatmas are answering. And the chronology of them is speculative, although there's some points it's easy. So that's the Mahatma letters. But of course, there were two principal Mahatmas, or spiritual teachers, Madame Blavatsky's masters, who we're told were behind the foundation of the Theosophical Society. One was the Master Moria, and the other one was the Master Kukumi. And Olcott, again, Old Diaries, Volume 1, talks about being introduced to these masters and also receiving letters from other masters connecting to a group called the Brotherhood or Observatory of Luxor. So there's more than one, or more than two, more than the principal two, but the two principal founders, the inner founders, as we like to call them, of the Theosophical Society, are the masters M and KH. And the founding myth, if you will, founding story of the TS is that this occult brotherhood, of which they are members, has existed for millennia, mostly hidden, and the 19th century was a crucial turning point for Western culture, with the rise of materialism on the one hand and the rise of materialistic spirituality on the other, such as the spiritualist movement, and perhaps foreseeing the growth and domination of Western technology throughout the 20th century and its capacity for destructiveness. The Mahatmas are alleged to have, those two Mahatmas are alleged to have persuaded other members of the Brotherhood to allow them to give out, first of all, to reveal the existence of this Brotherhood, but also to give out a kind of a sketch or outline or portions of that wisdom in order to act as a counterbalance to the materialism of the age. That's the story of the Mahatmas and the Mahatma letters. Okay, what is a human being? Is in Sanskrit, one of the terms used to describe the human mind is manas, where some people seem to think that the term man ultimately derives from, but I'm not so sure about that. But the key idea is that man, and in this case man includes woman, it's a gender neutral term. Man is a thinker, and again, this is not the idea that it's all, or it shouldn't be taken to be the idea that everything's abstract and it's reading dry and dusty textbooks. When we say that man is a thinker, we mean that man, or humanity, is an evolving wave, if you will, of consciousness. And consciousness is key, because it's consciousness that gives us the power of choice. However, as thinkers, as thinking beings, how many times have we done something amiss or hurt somebody's feelings. Oh, sorry, I didn't think about that. Thinking is key, consciousness is key. Man is a thinker, humans are thinking beings, and we are evolving beings because of that consciousness and that thinking. And the consciousness and the thinking allows us to build up our level of perception, which means building up our level of perceptiveness, and the more perceptive we are, hopefully, the more sensitive and compassionate we become to our environment and the various kinds of other lives throughout it. So in that sense, within the theosophical scheme, man, or the human kingdom, is very much in the middle. There are a range of kingdoms below, in which self-consciousness has not been reached, and there are realms, so-called Dhyanic, or divine hierarchies above. But it's here, at the human stage, that we're facing at this point in time a challenge between pure mind, pure consciousness, and the desire nature. And it depends on our evolutionary path whether or not whether we go down the path of I want, and that lower thing, we follow those lower impulses, or whether or not we I perceive, I judge, I choose not to. That's where the dynamic is playing out at the moment. And Theosophy teaches that in future periods of evolution, the mind principle will receive a much greater development. And then obviously there are other faculties in the human being, such as intuition, for example. In theosophical teaching, Theosophy loves the number 7, and it's often said that there are 7 principles that constitute a human being, from the physical body at the lowest level of expression to the divine spark, or the Atman, the spirit, at the highest. So that, in essence, is the theosophical concept of man. What is karma? I once read somewhere, I can't remember where, that it's, if anybody does any embroidery, it's the parable of the careless seamstress. As you sow, so shall you reap. But more seriously, karma is a Sanskrit word. It simply means action. And as it's, even within India, it's meant different things at different times, to be honest. It comes from the root kri, to do. And as it's been translated to the West, sometimes it's fallen on more fertile soil than others. So sometimes it can be interpreted very fatalistically, and other times it's more of a dynamic thing. And that's both in theosophical accounts of karma and theosophical accounts of reincarnation, and the two are pretty much two halves of the same coin. If you will see that there is kind of different teachers within the theosophical tradition, never mind without it, sometimes emphasize one aspect of it a bit more than the other. I can only go by my understanding, which is that it's a principle of responsibility, and it ties back to that earlier definition of humanity as a conscious being, because it's a question of consciousness and of choice. So karma is not, in that sense, what happens to us. Karma is what we do, and what we do creates a momentum, and is very often likely to either put us in situations in which the energy that we're enacting is mirrored, or it will generate that energy, that kind of response, when we're acting in that manner. So a very simple example: if I'm in a very grumpy mood and go around barking at people and shouting at people, then sooner or later somebody's going to shout back. That's karma in action. For every action, there is an opposite and equal reaction. When we come to the question of karma as fate, that's a bit more complicated. If it's the case that, and it's often, people when they talk about karma very often, are more interested, it seems to me, in the question of bad karma. It's perhaps a foible of human nature that when we are happy or get things that we get an outrageous good fortune, we don't say, I don't deserve this. Why am I so lucky? I don't deserve this. But if something bad happens to us, we do tend to think, I don't deserve this. So when we come to the question of karma as what happens, as actions, if we take the view that everything that happens is karmic, then that does seem to rule out free will. And free will is very much a part of the theosophical scheme. It's an essential part, arguably, of any type of spirituality. Because without free will, then we can do nothing to progress along the path, the spiritual path. It's perfectly possible for us to argue that our liberation is preordained and we just have to wait for it, but then that leads to quietism, with the idea that we don't have to do anything, we just sit back and wait for things to happen. The Buddha argued that what karma was, in the Pali Canon it's referred to as karma, what karma is volitional action. It's something that we choose to do. That generates karma. If it's something that's not done volitionally, there is no karma. And ultimately, it seems to boil down from this perspective, to law versus freedom, or putting it another way, matter versus spirit. The realm of matter, or prakriti, is a realm of fixed laws. And once a certain physical action has been enacted, or something at the physical level has been enacted, then there is no change in the consequence. That's law-driven. It's in that sense preordained. But at the level of spirit, that's the level of our response. Our response is free. I can choose to react automatically, sometimes bitterly, angrily, or whatever, or I can choose to let things go. The opening verses of the Dhammapada tells us that if we repay hate with hate, then hate will never cease. So that's the idea of karma as a way of freedom. But there are still many people that seem to think that karma is absolute fate and predestination, or it's another way of looking at it. Some people say is the karma is the past, we can't change it, but we can change what we do in the future. But it's a very complicated question, and I don't think that anybody has I don't think there's any one answer to this particular question that will satisfy everybody. But for me, the idea of karma is more psychological than physical, and I think that's probably the best way of looking at it. When I first started coming to the TS regularly, not the first time, but when I first started coming in, on a more or less daily basis, and was volunteering in the library upstairs, the librarian was Lillian Story, and she could remember back to a time when there were visits from the then international president, Jana Rajadasa, and apparently he had this little bon mot, this little saying. It says, if you look after your Dharma, you will look after your karma. Dharma is duty, it's responsibility. It's often presented with terms of the Indian caste system, where there are 4 traditional castes, and each one has its role in society. It's not looking at it so much in terms of all these various different minor rules and regulations, or the rigidity of the system, which allegedly came in later. Originally, in its origin, it seems that the caste system was much more flexible. But that's a matter for historians. Dharma is duty, and in one sense, we can think about Dharma as human beings, irrespective of whether we're male or female, black, white, whatever. And we have, as human beings, we have particular responsibilities to other human beings, to the planet, to make sure that our economies don't overstrip themselves and degrade the environment to the ultimate detriment not only of ourselves but of the other creatures with whom we share the planet. That's the normal sense in which Dharma is used, and then there are, if you like, more specific dharmas. There is an individual Dharma, which is it's a common theme for our cultures, that we're born as little shrieking, helpless infants, little babies, and our parents raise us, and we grow to adulthood, and then our parents get old, and as we start looking after them. That's our personal Dharma. It's our responsibility, but it's not a responsibility like you have to fill in your tax returns by the end of the year or face getting a fine. It's a responsibility that's born out of our nature. It's the nature of things. And the two terms are pretty much in that sense synonymous. Okay? Dharma is, in that sense, nature. And indeed, again, in the Buddhist system, it's a multi-level term, and ultimately Dharma means the ultimate constituents of things, Dhamma. So yes, Dharma is duty or responsibility, but a duty or responsibility that's born out of what nature is. It's natural order. Interesting question. Theosophy has been around for me for virtually all of my life, my adult life, and a little bit earlier. I first encountered theosophy when 10, 11, something like that. I can't remember. I was a very peculiar kid, and I used to like reading very obscure books, or at least owning very obscure books. And then I discovered the old Theosophical bookshop in Great Russell Street when I was still at school, and I eventually joined fully about quite late, about 92, and worse. I spent most of my adult life working here, and it's broadens. I would hope it's broadened my horizons. The thing that I find with me, and I don't know how other people find it, is it becomes so much a part of you that you pretty much find it impossible to imagine a world not seen theosophically. You know, it's like if I didn't have some kind of a theosophical perspective, then I kind of get the feeling that I would have nothing. But it's been, at times it's been an extremely pleasant and joyful experience. At other times, when you're banging your head against an obscure text, or Encountering an obscure person, it's less joyful, perhaps. Um, it's another aspect of the TS that appeals to me, and it may not necessarily appeal to everybody else, is that the TS is very much not perfect, and it doesn't claim to be perfect. And so there's no, in a sense, sort of false sanctity. We are what we are, um, and it doesn't create the approach that the society takes and theosophy takes does not insist upon a big rupture or disjuncture between the way that we live in the world and how we perceive ourselves as spiritual beings. And again, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong in, say, those that choose to become hermits or monks, or who choose to become very, if you will, visible in their choice of faith path. But it seems to me that theosophy and the Theosophical Society, as it's become, places much value on companionship combined with ultimate individual responsibility, and that, to me, is the most appealing part of it, because it's there's nobody ordering me what to do or what to believe, but I get the strength and support and joy from meeting fellow students on the path. And if you like, it's in that sense, in its best sense, the TS is one big family. It's a family of kindred spirits who have goals in common, even though we may individually be making our own particular way there. Well, my previous answer, I did just say that the TS, or the theosophical approach, is not to foster, if you will, a monastic approach. We're all very much in the world, and so we don't divorce ourselves from the world. We should act as beacons of theosophical understanding and light throughout. And I do know of members that were in the habit of, giving books to people that expressed an interest, even if it was only a polite interest. And many TS members are very active in their local community, whether it be various. There was one former member I know, she's passed now, that was a prison visitor. She would go and visit prisoners who had nobody to visit them and talk to them. And there are others that are, again, a recent national president that passed had been and still remains some actual activity in his local church, and he didn't see no contradiction between his traditional Christian upbringing and his enhanced, if you will, theosophical understanding. In England, and I think generally in the West, groups like the TOS tend to be less active, simply because they raise money rather than act. Whereas I know that places, TOS means Theosophical Order of Service, for those of you that don't know. Whereas in places like India and Pakistan, where the level of social security is lower, then it's often a much more hands-on approach, and they have actual schools and things like that, and there are dispensaries. Whereas in the West, it's often best that we raise the money and give it to people that are on the front line and know better. But it doesn't preclude people from getting active. I remember my first ever landlady, who was also a theosophist and very active in the Theosophical Order of Service, and they came up with a plan for granny sitting, so that if there was anybody that had an elderly relative that needed somebody to sit with them for a while, they would go and do it, because it was something that didn't require any specialist expertise. It just required, the ability to empathize. So yeah, community service is very important because, well, every time we set foot outside of our front doors, we're in the community. And in point of fact, we can never get away from the community, because the community is society and we are social beings, and everything about me and about you and about everybody has been socialized, even the language that I'm using. So it's impossible to get away from community service. Every time you open a door for somebody, politeness is community service. I think that it's important that we all foster that awareness of people as being, we're all members of one another, if you will. Which I know can be hard sometimes if there's a massive queue somewhere and somebody pushes you out of the way, or things like that. Really, the day-to-day struggle of life, it can be a bit. We can tend to forget these things, but theosophy community is very important to theosophy. It's important within the Theosophical Society, and it's also important without, and in the way that theosophists act as good members of society. There's nothing that we don't do that can be considered harmful to society. So yeah. Love is just a four-letter words. The TS, or Theosophy, historically has not had much of an interest in romantic love, quite clearly, because it's tended to regard, if you like, the physical or the emotional, the lower levels of manifestation. We can contrast that to the ideas of romantic love, chivalry that sort of emerged in the Middle Ages, around the troubadour tradition, and the Arthurian cycle, which has been taken on by neo-pagans and other esotericists. It doesn't focus so much on the idea of love as a one-on-one relationship, although there is theosophical literature about the importance of family life, the grihastha ashrama, the family stage, and it's in that sense it is presented as being love is important in the sense that it's a recognition of me in you and you in me, of our common humanity, and two halves of the same coin, if you will, and that's the solidarity and the community. But more often, theosophical accounts look at the idea of love as a love for not just one person of our species, and not just for our species, but for all of creation. That's the idea. I mean, it's very often presented in the idea, in the term or phrase of compassion. And if you like, love as compassion is the idea that we treat all of nature as an end in itself and not a means to an end. And love is very often equated in some of the later literature, I think, with buddhi, where it's presented as love wisdom, the idea that knowing doesn't just involve an abstract cognition, but knowing at the deep level, at the beyond mental level, involves not just knowing, but knowing in sympathy with. Knowledge is union, and of course another word for union again from the Sanskrit, is yoga. So in that sense, love is the ultimate form of yoga, because if we love everything equally, then we are at one with everything. That is the, if you like, the deeper, impersonal, theosophical approach to love. Gods. And right, the very first question that I answered, I said that theosophy is divine wisdom. And going back to Madame Blavatsky, she said, she was very insistent in, like, the key to theosophy, that it's not God in the sense of a monotheistic being. It's wisdom of the gods. In that sense, theosophy is a non-theistic system. Theism is the idea that there is a single being that has the specific things, has a specific relationship to creation. God in the beginning, God made, things like that. And that we can have, we have knowledge of that through revelation, but that's it. And we can approach a loving relationship with that being through worship and following of God's laws. And in the theosophical approach, God is, well, to begin with, she doesn't like to use the term God. But even when it's used, what it should refer to is an impersonal principle. And there's the issue of this impersonal. The reason that impersonality is important is that because it is too big a thing to be confined by any definition or by any human image or by any particular human set of laws or scriptures, and consequently it's, if you will, something that we're always striving towards but never quite reaching. And that's, to me, seems to be a big, important part of the concept here, that it's not something that we can ever reach, but we can always strive towards. And given the fact that in the theosophical cosmology that Blavatsky outlines, there are stages, future stages of human evolution in which we wouldn't even recognize as being human, if you like, they're superhuman. And even at that stage, it's like this, it's always going to be more, always going to be more. So it's an endlessness, and with it comes this idea of endless cycles of time, whereas the theistic idea tends to have, if you like, a beginning, there's a middle, there's a fall, and a thing, and then there's a cataclysmic end. And if we adopt a theosophical approach, we tend to stop looking, or should stop looking, for cataclysmic ends or apocalyptic ends, which hasn't stopped some theosophists from looking for the Maitreya to come and bring the golden age. But that really is, if you like, my way of thinking, violates the spirit of the original message. So God is a principle. God is all, but that doesn't mean that everything is divine in the sense that it's worthy of worship. So there's nothing in this room that's worthy of worship per se. What it means is that everything is a fleeting reflection of an endless sea of potency, if you will. Potency is what it can be, and all these passing glimmers of potentiality of what actually is the now. So God is love, God is wisdom, but God is not any particular school of thought, it's not any particular teacher, it's always moving on. God is, in that sense, the whole thing, the whole evolutionary process. And I think that's really what a lot of people find who join the Theosophical Society. Some of them find it inspiring, some people find it mind-boggling. I think I did at the beginning, but the important thing is that it's this idea of process process, and if we look to the process and not any particular teacher, then we have the option, of avoiding these human conflicts where I might kill you because you call your God a different name to what I call my God, or I might kill you because you have a different set of scriptures than I have. If we look upon the ideas of the divine, of the transcendent, as infinite potentiality or potency rather than one historical, culturally conditioned set of scriptures or practices, then the human race will be, that much, I think, that much happier and that much better off. And that is, if you will, one of the offerings, or what the TS has to offer. The problem, I think, with this is that it can be a very abstract idea, and it's sometimes hard for people to grasp it, and also very hard sometimes to inspire people. People like to be, or seems to be, and they like to be inspired by very concrete things. People will die for their family, they will fight for their country, for their religion, but an abstract and impersonal principle seems to be less inspiring. So that's if you like, the pros and cons of the theosophical approach, which historically the TS has not emphasized emotional worship or things like that. But then again, in to balance things out, then you've got the worship of individuals instead, and the personality worship that Mrs. Besant didn't cultivate, but certainly received, and Bishop Leadbeater, and then the various movements, the side movements, in which the emotional side of things are reintroduced. So, but what is God? God is everything, and not one particular thing. God is a process. God is an eternity, and we can't measure or define eternity. But if you want to characterize it, it's spirit and matter and their interactions. It's manifold creation or manifestation. What is truth? Well, Madame Blavatsky wrote an article called "What is Truth" when she was living in London, and she begins by paraphrasing an article by Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon's article on truth begins, from memory, "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, but he would not stay for an answer, referring to the gospel story in which Pontius Pilate asked Jesus what truth is, but isn't particularly interested in hearing what he's got to say. Truth is that which is real, which sounds circular. It probably is circular argument. Truth is that which is real. So we might ask ourselves, what's real? To me, psychologically, I'm the center of the universe. I'm sorry, but I venture to suggest that for most of us, we act as if we're the center of the universe. So I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing, and you can do it in a bad way and a good way. Obviously, I can act as if I was the center of the universe and be absolutely nasty to everybody. I certainly don't try not to do that. When I say we act as if we're the center of the universe, I see things from my perspective. And in order to try and reach above my perspective, sometimes involves a stretch of the imagination, sometimes it involves a leap of the mind to actually get a bigger picture. And that bigger picture, going back to this idea of God as eternity, we can keep on making the picture bigger and bigger. So, and I don't know when I'm going to shuffle off this mortal coil, but at some point I will, and it won't cause barely a ripple in the universe. And in 100 years' time, nobody will have heard of me, or even less. will the human species be around forever? Possibly, possibly not, but it will. Chances are it will evolve into something else. So, if we take the true to be that which is eternal, then there's no truth in this world, because just about everything is going to fade away. According to Madame Blavatsky, but matter itself evolves and changes over time, and its laws of combination and association change over time. So there is an old Upanishadic prayer, which is from the unreal lead me to the real, from darkness lead me to light, from death lead me to immortality. And the unreal, the asat, in this sense, is taken to be that which is finite and conditioned. And the real is that which is eternal. It's that divinity. And it's a distinction, if you will, between manifest and unmanifest. Everything we see is manifest. It has limitations. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, pretty much, certainly at the biological level. And beyond that, it's hypothesized or claimed that there is an eternity that doesn't have that beginning, middle, and end. It is truly timeless, and that is the real. And paradoxically, it's through the unreal that we see the real, because there was a British High Court judge who was a member of the Theosophical Society and founder of the Buddhist Lodge, and he, among other things, wrote single-handedly a manual on meditation, originally published by the Lodge, Buddhist Lodge, and then subsequently published under his own name. He was called Christmas Humphreys. And at the end of his book on concentration and meditation, which is, to my mind, one of the best books on specifically theosophical approaches to meditation, and towards the end he has a list of meditational thoughts, something to sit and meditate on. And one of the things that it says is, one of the sayings there is nothing infinite apart from finite things. There is nothing infinite apart from finite things. And I first came across that via a lecture from one of the former national presidents here. And if you think about it, it seems we think of infinity as stretching on to eternity, but there has to be something that stretches on to eternity. And it's literally that infinity consists of an infinite amount of finite things, an infinite amount of non-infinite things. The two things are not separate. Infinity is, if you like, me repeated again and again and again, tomorrow, until I die. And then, if reincarnation is a true doctrine, then I'm reborn somewhere, and it goes again and again and again. And so infinity in that sense is an endless series of finite things. And that's where we see that truth, or the eternal, and the ephemeral are not actually opposite, but parts of the same holistic picture. So what it is that our finitude is an integral part of our understanding and expressing that infinity. And so the truth is that the ultimate truth doesn't lie with us, but we are the means whereby that ultimate truth finds a concrete expression. So if I say that God is love, and if I say, well, God is love, but God is abstract, God has no body, God has no parts, God has no relations, then to say God is love is to say love blank. But if I say I am a manifestation, partial manifestation of God, and God is love. Therefore, I choose to manifest love, to exercise love, or any other divine quality that you choose to think of. I do that by exercising that love towards something, towards an other. And in doing so, whether it be another person or another part of the manifestation, the animal kingdom or whatever, and in doing that, I actually actualize love. And for being abstract or unmanifest, the love becomes concrete or manifest. And again, it's two halves of the same coin, to my way of thinking. So that is the truth. The truth, the ultimate truth in Theosophy, is that there is nothing infinite apart from finite things, and that the abstract truth, or the unmanifest truth, must by definition find manifestation, which is this, and this eternal progress and change